Well, hello. My name is Kate Bachelder Odell from the Wall Street Journal's editorial board. I'm here today, and we've got a great panel with us who's going to help us unpack the latest results of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute's latest poll. And so today, our esteemed panel here, we've got Rachel Hoff, who runs the policy shop at the Reagan Institute. We have Tom Bevan, who co-founded Real Clear Politics, and Eugene Daniels, who writes Politico's playbook. So this is a great crew for understanding what drives and shapes public opinion. And so, Rachel, why don't you start us off by walking us through what are the top maybe two or three conclusions you draw from this year's polling results?
Sure. Thanks, Kate, and great to be with all of you. The Reagan Institute's been doing this polling now for 5 years. We actually started our polling in 2018, and so 2023 represents 5 years of polling. And one thing that means is that we can start to see the trend lines on where public opinion is shifting and also where it's staying the same. And both of those tell us a lot about what the American people believe about a variety of national defense and foreign policy issues that we test in this poll. I'll highlight three key takeaways from this year's latest survey results from November 2023 that really jumped out to us at the Reagan Institute. The first is absolute rock solid consistency on support for U.S. providing security assistance to Ukraine. So there's been a lot of conversation in Washington, a lot of media narratives around waning support for Ukraine, around fatigue with sending continued aid to support Ukraine in their fight for freedom. But what the Reagan National Defense Survey and previous Reagan Institute polling shows is those numbers are not moving at all. Compared to 6 months ago, we had an interim poll in the summer of 2023, and also a year ago, this time in 2022, our polling shows that 60% of the American people want to send U.S. security assistance to Ukraine, and that's not shifting at all. And it's also not shifting in the partisan crosstabs. So the same numbers of Democrats and Republicans are support continued aid to Ukraine. The second is a real shift in the last 5 years among the perception of which country poses the greatest threat to the U.S. In 2018, 5 years ago, 21% of Americans said China. It was number 2 on the list after Russia. Today, 51% of Americans say China is the country that poses the greatest threat to the U.S. So there's a lot of consensus, again, on a bipartisan basis to kind of align with what we might perceive as the bipartisan national security consensus in Washington about the China threat. We have some new data this year we can get into later, or listeners can check out, about Americans being a little bit overly confident in our military capabilities to combat that threat, but they certainly are aware and kind of can really come into consensus around the existence of that threat. And then just the third one briefly, in response to what we're seeing in Ukraine, in the Indo-Pacific, and certainly also in the Middle East, Americans are really supportive of a global U.S. military posture and American leadership in the world more broadly. We asked them to kind of how we should allocate military resources around the world. Those top 3 regions, Middle East, Asia, and Europe, are top 3, about 20% each. But in terms of the other regions of the world, South America, Africa, et cetera, Americans put 10% in each region. So kind of wanted to leave no region ignored and really are supportive of broad American leadership and a force posture in terms of our military presence to reflect that.
Well, great, Rachel. Thanks for giving us that rundown. We'll take them on a firing line one by one. Ukraine is attracting a lot of attention right now on Capitol Hill and debate of whether the Congress can get more funding for Ukraine through this year. So, Tom, I'd be interested in your thoughts. There has been a drop-off on Republican support for Ukraine, and the poll now shows it roughly holding steady. But also you see in this poll that those who think Ukraine is winning support aid, and it may reflect what one of my colleagues calls the Jacksonian impulse in America, that if Americans get involved, they want to prevail. So how would you characterize the declining support on the right for Ukraine? And do you think it's possible to get further aid through this year?
Well, that remains to be seen. I mean, it certainly is true that there is a schism within the Republican Party over Ukraine aid. It has become a big fight now in the Senate. Mitch McConnell is trying to get that aid through, but is facing some resistance from some of his caucus members, which seemed unlikely just a few months ago. And then on the other hand, you had Speaker Johnson, come out the other day and say that the Ukraine aid was a top priority for the American people and for the House. So, but again, a lot of that depends on the details. Is it connected to border security? Is it not? How's that going to work its way through both chambers? Obviously, the president would sign it, but there's no question that, and this is an ongoing debate within the Republican Party and within the Republican primary process as well. And you see that schism, and I think it's likely to continue. There is a more, you can call it isolationist, you can call it nationalist wing of the Republican Party represented by Donald Trump that continues to say and believe that a lot of the aid that's going to Ukraine should actually be spent here instead. And I think that discussion, that debate is going to continue.
Yeah, you're definitely right. And elsewhere in the poll, I noticed that there's broad concern among the public that other authoritarians such as Xi Jinping might take a play from Putin and wander into Taiwan. What I mean by that is Americans are kind of concerned about connecting the dots between some of these conflicts and don't view them in isolation, like Rachel was saying, kind of want to put keep some presence here and there. But you raise a good point, which is that there's a lot of focus on problems here at home and a need to spend on those as opposed to Ukraine. Eugene, any top line takeaways from you on that front? How do you read the mood from looking through this poll?
Yeah, I think, that kind of whether we should keep money here is also within the left. I'll say very quickly before getting into the mood. When you talk to folks that, members of Congress would call far left or like the Squad, those kinds of folks, they have that same kind of conversation while they support funding for Ukraine, to support trying to figure out how to help Israel in their fight against Hamas at this point. They're also, that's always coming up. So that's something that's kind of across the board on the left and the right, the extreme aspects of the left and the right. I mean, as I was going through all of these findings, what I was really thinking about is how this is just such a volatile electorate. They are angry and uneasy. They are scared, right? They don't trust the institutions anymore. They have concerns and questions about what should America's role within the world be. And how should we be doing that? And sometimes those findings are in conflict, right? I think that idea that the American people think one way or another. I cover mostly domestic politics, and politicians often try to make it really easy to understand what the American people are thinking. And I think they're telling us over and over again, whether it's domestic policy or foreign policy, whether it's immigration or climate change, is that they're able to hold more ideas in their head than politicians and folks in DC give them credit for. That they are able to think, as you said, tying Taiwan and China with Ukraine and Russia, right? That is not something that we would have given, voters credit for years ago, but they understand that there's a possible rising tide of authoritarianism and that is in direct conflict with how they think of this country. And so being able to read through how they're feeling and kind of dig more into these findings is something I think that a lot of people should be doing, because there's a lot of interesting stuff in here.
Yeah, I certainly agree that the results suggest that voters can hold ideas in tension and present a pretty sophisticated understanding of the issues of the world. Rachel, one thing I noticed was that support for defending Taiwan with the U.S. military is up with 46 from 39 a couple years ago. And to your point, much larger focus, public focus on China. What do you think that increase is owed to? Is the public more focused on Taiwan, more aware of it? Is the president or Congress raising the profile of the issue?
Those numbers have been shifting year on year, Kate, since we started polling, both for deterrence, support for deterrence measures to prevent a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And also we have a separate set of questions where we ask, worst case scenario, if there is a Chinese invasion, what U.S. actions would the American people support, whether that's economic sanctions, no-fly zones, or even U.S. troops on the ground to defend Taiwan. And across the board, both for deterrence and in case of conflict, those numbers are steadily increasing. I think it comes down to rising awareness of the China threat. But I also want to say that there's some data in our survey that shows that when the American people are informed why Taiwan matters, they're even more likely to support both deterrence measures and defense measures in the case of a contingency or conflict. So when we've played around with kind of some message testing in the poll. If you remind people that Taiwan's a democracy in China's neighborhood, that Taiwan is strategically important in terms of their technology sector and their production of semiconductors that are so important to how people around the world, but particularly in the US, structure our commercial sector, but also semiconductors, of course, being so important in our national security realm. When you remind people of facts like that, why Taiwan matters, from practical things like technology and semiconductors to the values like freedom and democracy, support only increases. And so I think that shows to me, and one of the lessons of the survey is that political leaders who want to lead on these issues can help shape public opinion, not just sort of hold a finger to the wind and follow it.
Yeah, certainly. Tom, what role do you see this emerging consensus on China playing in the upcoming presidential election? It looks like there is getting to be a broadening public support for any number of measures, arming Taiwan, for instance. How do you think that's going to play in the presidential campaign? What does this tell you if you were advising candidates as they try to look to persuading voters?
Well, I'm not advising candidates, thank God. But
of course,
look,
apologies.
No,
I need to impugn your character.
No, that's okay. Look, it's obviously China's a huge issue on both sides, and it is part of the debate in the Republican primary, and will be part of the debate in the general election next year. I mean, there's just no question about it, and it's multifaceted. But I do think that the findings in this poll are really interesting. Not to mention the increasing support for Taiwan, especially as Rachel mentioned, after you sort of prompt voters or surveys respondents as to it being a democracy, it being a center, a hub for technology, those sorts of things, but also sending American troops. 46% were in favor of sending American troops. That's a huge number, in my opinion. We certainly haven't seen an appetite for that in anywhere. Not in Afghanistan, not in Ukraine, not anywhere. And so to the extent that continues to be an issue, the possibility of some sort of military intervention in Taiwan, I think that's a huge thing to keep an eye on. But it's definitely going to be part of the campaign. And obviously Republicans will try and say, particularly if Donald Trump is the nominee, that he was tough on China and that Joe Biden has been soft on China. And I think the Biden administration, if Joe Biden is the nominee as a candidate, will turn around and say the exact opposite, that he picked up where Trump left. He's actually been tougher on China, and he'll list all of the reasons and policies why that's the case. Being tough on China is a political winner with the general electorate. And so both candidates, whoever the nominees will certainly take that posture in the general election.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah. Eugene, you're covering the White House very closely every day. And so I'm curious how you read the White House's strategy to potentially get some of its supplemental funding done by the end of the year. What's the appetite? We see in this poll some discussion about immigration. What's the appetite on the left for a potential border for Ukraine deal? Do the contours of that exist?
Yeah, the thing that's really interesting here is kind of popping up over and over and over again, is the White House being at odds with the left aspect of its party, right? That the left would say, do not make a deal with anyone, as someone put it to me yesterday, selling out immigrants for Ukraine funding. But then you have the White House, who weeks ago put out the contours of their supplemental deal that included money for Ukraine, included money for Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific, immigration, and that conversation has been going on for a long time. And so you have some Republicans saying, like, we want to deal with immigration in it. The White House is ready for that to happen. They have been staying out of negotiations kind of since the end of that first year, when we saw a lot of their bills go down in flames, not wanting Joe Biden to be the 101st senator. So they're kind of allowing the Senate leaders and House leaders to have those discussions. But there's also an appetite for Senate Democrats to deal with immigration, right? because they're trying to defang, as we head into an election year, the attacks that Republicans have been using and are probably still going to use no matter what the deal ends up having in it, that Democrats are soft on immigration, that this should be an issue that should take over a lot of the aspects of the campaign. And this White House is ready to make that deal. They're ready to sign it. I think one of the things that they have said to me over and over and over again is that they don't want to see these things decoupled, right? They don't want to see like a Ukraine bill and a bill that only deals with funding for Israel. They want to see these things going together because they very well know that getting the funding for Ukraine depends on making sure that the Israel funding is tied to that, right? That is much more bipartisan. There hasn't, especially because it's so fresh in people's minds, there's not been a softening of any support of funding for Israel on the right. So that means in the House it would pass. So keeping these things together are important for the White House. And really, Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House now, doesn't seem to have an issue with that, right? I think it's the contours and figuring out how much money is. And that's kind of surprising because he's someone who has voted against Ukraine funding in the past.
Eugene, thanks for bringing up Israel, especially because this is since last year. This is the first survey we have with this new information about how the public reads what happened on October 7th. So, Rachel, I would be interested in your thoughts. We've been having a lot of, for instance, campus protests and other things suggesting that the public public support for Israel is waning. But in this poll, I don't see that. I see American support for Israel to be pretty fixed and enduring. What explains that disconnect, or how should we view these results?
Yeah, it's a great point, Kate. The numbers of the American people, over 70% consider Israel an ally. We asked some new questions after the October 7th violence and resulting conflict around, should the U.S. be doing more across a number of different areas to support Israel, to support the Palestinians, to counter Hamas? And the answer was a resounding yes, we should be supporting Israel, we should be supporting the Palestinians, and we should be countering Hamas, as well as Iran's larger influence in the region. But your point about sort of the what we've been reading in headlines is a good one. As we've dug into the crosstabs there, younger Americans under 30, that 18 to 30 demographic is certainly an outlier compared to the other age demographics. We look at partisan demographic breakdowns a lot in our survey, given that we're a DC-based organization, but there the age demographics really matter. And I think we're certainly seeing that on college campuses.
Right. Another fixed reality that this poll seems to reflect is that the American public does support a strong national defense and has pretty deep support of that. Tom, I was curious your thoughts. There seems to be, on the left, Eugene's describing a lot of higher social priorities, not as much democratic support for higher defense spending. And then on the right, some valid but perhaps overblown concerns about the country's fiscal position that preclude more defense spending. But here, what we see in the poll is that the public understands the need for a strong military. Do you think anything approaching a return to Cold War defense spending is on the horizon given the China threat, or how do you see that debate shaping up?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I guess it depends on who wins the election and what the posture is and what the future holds. Obviously, a lot of this is driven by events. I mean, the priority of the Middle East in this poll was at 11%, I think, last year, and jumped to 31% this year based on what happened on October 7th. So we'll have to see how that plays out. I mean, I guess the one thing that jumped out at me, and this is not a new finding, but that trust in the military has declined from 70% in 2018 down to 46 or 48% this year. And it's roughly the same, in line with where it has been the last couple of years. That's a pretty significant drop. And obviously, Eugene mentioned at the beginning, there's been a loss of trust across the board in institutions, from the Supreme Court to the media to Congress. But the drop among the military, I think, is concerning. The good news is, at the same time, a slim majority, 51%, said they would recommend the military to a family member. And even better, that the support for military spending has actually increased a couple of points over those same 5 years. So while there are questions about the military, trust issues in the military, as you mentioned, Kate, support for military spending on a whole host of issues has really broad and deep support, and that support has not wavered over the last 5 years.
Yeah, the public confidence in the military question seemed to have reached a low in 2021 and held somewhat stable. And there are very divergent theories about what's causing that. But I think what's not in question is that it would be a prerequisite for any sort of broad support for more defense spending, that the public has confidence in what the military is doing. We are tight on time today, but I do want to get Rachel in with a last flyer question about artificial intelligence, because I thought the poll was interesting to ask about it. And there seems to be a certain American ambivalence about integrating artificial intelligence into our military capabilities. And one thing I'll just note is that our adversaries are not ambivalent about that question and are doing that. So Rachel, how do you read these results about how much does the public understand about AI, and what accounts for this halting view the public seems to have about it?
Sure. Well, I'll note to start that I don't think our adversaries are doing a lot of public opinion polling to see what their people and their publics think about these issues. But you're right, there is a certain ambivalence among the American public, particularly our poll being focused on national defense issues around integrating AI more into our military capabilities. Some say yes, some say no, but most among the options say it's too soon to tell. It's too soon to form a definitive opinion. And we do find that those numbers shift a little bit with some messages around, as you say, though, the ways that our adversaries and our strategic competitors are investing in these technologies and are driving forward. And so positioning it sort of as a area where we need to establish a strategic advantage in terms of geopolitics helps increase support for integrating AI technologies into our military capabilities. But certainly the public isn't there yet. And this is an area too, where I think leadership from Washington, from national security voices on both sides of the aisle will be crucial to explaining not only why it matters in terms of our capabilities vis-a-vis our competitors, but also the safeguards that the military and the national security establishment has in place to assuage ethical concerns along those lines. I think those are important for the public to know as well.
Yes, well, thanks, Rachel. And I'm going to wrap it up to keep tight on time. But thanks, everyone, to my fellow panelists. This is a survey is a great snapshot of how Americans view America's role in the world. So thanks to the Reagan Foundation for taking it and for taking the time to chat about it with me.